Chapter 18. The Oldest Person in the World. "We return in triumph, Charlie," cried Mr. Wonka, as the great glass elevator began to slow down. "Once more your dear family will all be together again." The elevator stopped and the doors slid open, and there was the chocolate room and the chocolate river and the Oompa Loompas, and in the middle of it all, the great bed belonging to the old grandparents. "Charlie," said Grandpa Joe, rushing forward, "thank heavens you're back." Charlie hugged him, then he hugged his mother and his father. "Is she here?" he said. "Grandma Georgina?" Nobody answered. Nobody did anything except Grandpa Joe, who pointed to the bed. He pointed, but he didn't look where he was pointing. None of them looked at the bed except Charlie. He walked past them all to get a better view, and he saw at one end of the bed the two babies, Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George, both tucked in and sleeping peacefully, and at the other end— "Don't be alarmed," said Mr. Wonka, running up and placing a hand on Charlie's arm. "She's bound to be just a teeny bit overplussed. I warned you about that." "What have you done to her?" cried Mrs. Bucket. "My poor old mother." Propped up against the pillows at the other end of the bed was the most extraordinary-looking thing Charlie had ever seen. Was it some ancient fossil? It couldn't be that, because it was moving slightly. And now it was making sounds. Croaking sounds, the kind of sounds a very old frog might make if it knew a few words. "Well, well, well," it croaked, "if it isn't dear Charlie." "Grandma," cried Charlie. "Grandma Georgina. Oh, oh." Her tiny face was like a pickled walnut. There were such masses of creases and wrinkles that the mouth and eyes and even the nose were sunken almost out of sight. Her hair was pure white, and her hands, which were resting on top of the blanket, were just little lumps of wrinkly skin. The presence of this ancient creature seemed to have terrified not only Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, but Grandpa Joe as well. They stood well back away from the bed. Mr. Wonka, on the other hand, was happy as ever. "My dear lady," he cried, advancing to the edge of the bed and clasping one of those tiny wrinkled hands in both of his. "Welcome home, and how are you feeling on this bright and glorious day?" "Not too bad," croaked Grandma Georgina. "Not too bad at all, considering my age." "Good for you," said Mr. Wonka. "Atta girl. All we've got to do now is find out exactly how old you are, then we shall be able to take further action." "You're taking no further action round here," said Mrs. Bucket, tight-lipped. "You've done enough damage already." "But my dear old muddle-headed mugwump," said Mr. Wonka, turning to Mrs. Bucket, "what does it matter that the old girl has become a trifle too old? We can put that right in a jiffy. Have you forgotten Wonkavite and how every tablet makes you 20 years younger? We shall bring her back. We shall transform her into a blossoming, blushing maiden in the twink of an eye." "What good is that when her husband's not even out of his nappies yet?" wailed Mrs. Bucket, pointing a finger at the 1-year-old Grandpa George so peacefully sleeping. "Madam," said Mr. Wonka, "let us do one thing at a time." "I forbid you to give that beastly Wonkavite," said Mrs. Bucket. "You'll turn her into a minus again, just as sure as I'm standing here." "I don't want to be a minus," croaked Grandma Georgina. "If I ever have to go back to that beastly minus land again, the Ganoulis will nickel me." "Fear not," said Mr. Wonka. "This time I myself will supervise the giving of the medicine. I shall personally see to it that you get the correct dosage. But listen very carefully now. I cannot work out how many pills to give you until I know exactly how old you are. That's obvious, isn't it?" "It's not obvious at all," said Mrs. Bucket. "Why can't you give her one pill at a time and play it safe?" "Impossible, madam. In very serious cases such as this one, Wonkavite doesn't work at all when given in small doses. You've got to throw everything at her in one go. You've got to hit her with it hard. A single pill wouldn't even begin to shift her. She's too far gone for that. It's all or nothing." "No," said Mrs. Bucket firmly. "Yes," said Mr. Wonka. "Dear lady, please listen to me. If you have a very serious headache and you need 3 aspirins to cure it, it's no good taking only one at a time and waiting 4 hours between each. You'll never cure yourself that way. You've got to gulp them all down in one go. It's the same with Wonkavite. May I proceed?" "Oh, all right, I suppose you'll have to," said Mrs. Bucket. "Good," said Mr. Wonka, giving a little jump and twirling his feet in the air. "Now then, how old are you, my dear Grandma Georgina?" "I don't know," she croaked. "I lost count of that years and years ago." "Don't you have any idea?" said Mr. Wonka. "Of course I don't," gibbered the old woman. "Nor would you if you were as old as I am." "Think," said Mr. Wonka. "You've got to think." The tiny old wrinkled brown walnut face wrinkled itself up even more. The others stood waiting, and the Oompa Loompas, enthralled by the sight of this ancient object, were all edging closer and closer to the bed. The two babies slept on. "Are you, for example, 100?" said Mr. Wonka, "or 110, or 120? "It's no good," she croaked. "I never did have a head for numbers." "This is a catastrophe," cried Mr. Wonka. "If you can't tell me how old you are, I can't help you. I dare not risk an overdose." Gloom settled upon the entire company, including for once Mr. Wonka himself. "You've messed it up good and proper this time, haven't you?" said Mrs. Bucket. "Grandma," Charlie said, moving forward to the bed. "Listen, Grandma, don't worry about exactly how old you might be. Try to think of a happening instead. Think of something that happened to you, anything you like, as far back as you can. It may help us." "Lots of things happened to me, Charlie. So many things have happened to me. But can you remember any of them, Grandma?" "Oh, I don't know, my darling. I suppose I could remember one or two if I thought hard enough." "Good, Grandma, good," said Charlie eagerly. "Now what is the very earliest thing you can remember in your whole life?" "Oh, my dear boy, that really would be going back a few years, wouldn't it? When you were little, Grandma, like me, can't you remember anything you did when you were little?" The tiny sunken black eyes glimmered faintly, and a sort of smile touched the corners of the almost invisible little slit of her mouth. "There was a ship," she said. "I can remember a ship. I couldn't ever forget that ship." "Go on, Grandma, a ship. What sort of ship? Did you sail on her?" "Of course I sailed on her, my darling. We all sailed on her. Where from? Where to?" Charlie went on eagerly. "Oh, no, I couldn't tell you that. I was just a tiny little girl." She lay back on the pillow and closed her eyes. Charlie watched her, waiting for something more. Everybody waited. No one moved. "It had a lovely name, that ship. There was something so beautiful about that name. But of course I couldn't possibly remember it." Charlie, who'd been sitting on the edge of the bed, suddenly jumped up. His face was shining with excitement. "If I said the name, Grandma, would you remember it then?" "I might, Charlie. Yes, I think I might." "The Mayflower," cried Charlie. The old woman's head jerked up off the pillow. "That's it," she croaked. "You've got it, Charlie. The Mayflower. Such a lovely name." "Grandpa," Charlie called out, dancing with excitement, "what year did the Mayflower sail for America?" "The Mayflower sailed out of Plymouth Harbour on September the 6th, 1620, said Grandpa Joe. "Plymouth," croaked the old woman. "That rings a bell too. Yes, it might easily have been Plymouth. 1620, cried Charlie. "Oh, my heavens above. That means you did it, Grandpa." "Well, now," said Grandpa Joe, "take 1620 away from 1972. That leaves... don't rush me, Charlie. That leaves 352. Jumping jack rackets, yelled Mr. Bucket. "She's 352 years old." "She's more," said Charlie. "How old did you say you were, Grandma, when you sailed on the Mayflower? Were you about 8? "I think I was even younger than that, my dear. I was only a bitty little girl, probably no more than 6. "Then she's 358, gasped Charlie. "That's Vitalwonk for you," said Mr. Wonka proudly. "I told you it was powerful stuff." 358, said Mr. Bucket. "It's unbelievable." "Just imagine the things she must have seen in her lifetime," said Grandpa Joe. "My poor old mother," wailed Mrs. Bucker. "What on earth—" "Patience, dear ladies," said Mr. Wonka. "Now comes the interesting part. Bring on the Wonkavite." An Oompa Loompa ran forward with a large bottle and gave it to Mr. Wonka. He put it on the bed. "How young does she want to be?" he asked. 78, said Mrs. Bucket firmly, "exactly where she was before this nonsense started." "Surely she'd like to be a bit younger than that," said Mr. Wonka. "Certainly not," said Mrs. Bucket. "It's too risky." Too risky, croaked Grandma Georgina. "You'll only minus me again if you try to be clever." "Have it your own way," said Mr. Wonka. "Now then, I've got to do a few sums." Another Oompa Loompa trotted forward, holding up a blackboard. Mr. Wonka took a piece of chalk from his pocket and wrote, "Present age of the person, 358. Age she wants to be, subtract this, 78. Number of years younger she must become, 280. If each pill of Wonkavite makes you 20 years younger, you must divide 280 by 20 to find out, 14. Oh, how many pills to give? 14. There's the calculation he put. "14 pills of Wonkavite exactly," said Mr. Wonka. The Oompa Loompa took the blackboard away, and Mr. Wonka picked up the bottle from the bed and opened it and counted out 14 little brilliant yellow pills. "Water," he said. Yet another Oompa Loompa ran forward with a glass of water. Mr. Wonka tipped all 14 pills into the glass. The water bubbled and frothed. "Drink it while it's fizzy," he said, holding the glass up to Grandma Georgina's lips, all in one gulp. She drank it. Mr. Wonka sprang back and took a large brass clock from his pocket. "Don't forget," he cried, "it's a year a second. She's got 280 years to lose. That'll take her 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Watch the centuries fall away." The room was so silent they could hear the ticking of Mr. Wonka's clock. At first nothing much happened to the ancient person lying on the bed. She closed her eyes and lay back. Now and again the puckered skin of her face gave a twitch, and her little hands jerked up and down, but that was all. "1 minute gone," called Mr. Wonka. "She's 60 years younger." "She looks just the same to me," said Mr. Bucket, sorry. "Of course she does," said Mr. Wonka. "What's a mere 60 years when you're over 300 to start with?" "Are you all right, Mother?" said Mrs. Bucket anxiously. "Talk to me, Mother." 2 minutes had gone by, called Mr. Wonka. "She's 120 years younger." And now definite changes were beginning to show on the old woman's face. The skin was quivering all over, and some of the deepest wrinkles were becoming less and less deep, the mouth less sunken, the nose more prominent. "Mother," cried Mrs. Bucket, "are you all right? Speak to me, Mother, please." Suddenly, with a sadness that made everyone jump, the old woman Suddenly, with a suddenness that made everyone jump, the old woman sat bolt upright in the bed and shouted, "Did you hear the news? Admiral Nelson has beaten the French at Trafalgar." "She's going crazy," said Mr. Bucket. "Not at all," said Mr. Wonka. "She's going through the 19th century. 3 minutes gone," said Mr. Wonka. Every second now she was growing slightly less and less shriveled, becoming more and more lively. It was a marvellous thing to watch. "Gettysburg," she cried. "General Lee is on the run." And a few seconds later she let out a great wail of anguish and said, "He's dead, he's dead, he's dead." "Who's dead?" said Mr. Bucket, craning forward. "Lincoln," she wailed. "There goes the train." "She must have seen it," said Charlie. "She must have been there." "She is there," said Mr. Wonka. "At least she was a few seconds ago." "Will someone please explain to me," said Mrs. Bucket. "What on earth—" 4 minutes gone," said Mr. Wonka. "Only 40 seconds left. Only 40 more years to lose." "Grandma," cried Charlie, running forward, "you're looking almost exactly like you used to. Oh, I'm so glad." "Just as long as it all stops when it's meant to," said Mrs. Bucket. "I'll bet it doesn't," said Mr. Bucket. "Something always goes wrong." "Not when I'm in charge of it, sir," said Mr. Wonka. "Time's up. She is now 78 years old. How do you feel, dear lady? Is everything all right?" "I feel tolerable," she said. "Just tolerable, but that's no thanks to you, you meddling old mackerel." There she was again, the same cantankerous, grumpy old Grandma Georgina that Charlie had known so well before it all started. Mrs. Bucket flung her arms around her and began weeping with joy. The old woman pushed her aside and said, "What, may I ask, are those 2 silly babies doing at the other end of the bed?" "One of them's your husband," said Mr. Bucket. "Rubbish," she said. "Where is George?" "I'm afraid it's true, Mother," said Mrs. Bucket. "That's him on the left. The other one's Josephine." You chiselling old cheeseburger," she shouted, pointing a fierce finger at Mr. Wonka. "What in the name of—" Now, said Mr. Wonka. "Let us not for mercy's sake have another row so late in the day. If everyone will keep their hair on and leave this to Charlie and me, we shall have them exactly where they used to be in the flick of a fly's wing."